Good afternoon. Welcome to this live broadcast of the National Center for Padre Pio. National Center for Padre Pio, located in Bartow, Pennsylvania. We are proud to be known as the home of Padre Pio in the USA. We are official representatives of Padre Pio's friary and the friars in San Giovanni Rotondo, Italy. We're an information center in the United States. We're also a spiritual resource and a great destination for Padre Pio. For Padre Pio's devotees. A lot of people won't be able to make the journey to San Giovanni Rotondo, but they can always make the journey to Bartow. We're seated on beautiful 106 acres, rolling hills in Berks County of Pennsylvania, but not too far out of the way, as I said, just about an hour from the city of Philadelphia. We have a beautiful reproduction chapel of Padre Pio's Friary Chapel there in San Giovanni Rotondo, the Our Lady of Grace Friary Chapel. We also have a world-class museum where you can see the largest collection that we're aware of in North America of Padre Pio relics and artifacts. Hope that you'll come by sometime and check that out. We were founded officially in 1971 by the late Mrs. Vera M. Calandra, following a grace-filled meeting that her and three of her children had in 1968, about 3 weeks before Padre Pio's death. Mrs. Calandra went seeking a miracle for her dying daughter, and she had all kinds of things to say to Padre Pio, as I hear her tell the story. But when she got in front of him, one-on-one, they kind of looked into each other's eyes, and Mrs. Calandra made a promise to God. She said, "Lord, please make a miracle that the world may know." And by that, she felt as though she was making a promise to God that if a miracle was granted and her daughter was healed, which she was, that she would let the world know about Padre Pio. And little did she know, 3 weeks later, Padre Pio would die. And she would go on to be instrumental in spreading the word about Padre Pio throughout much of the world, especially the United States and Canada. She spent a lot of time in San Giovanni Rotondo setting up an English office so that the friars could do English communications, where some members of her family would ultimately go and spend time working as well. But she helped to get all that set up. She became good friends with Father Alessio Parente, who took good care of Padre Pio for the last 7 years of his life, was kind of one of his personal assistants. And so in getting to know Father Alessio and traveling with him, learning more and more about Padre Pio. And what we try to do at the center is be very diligent about the types of information that we disseminate about Padre Pio. We get a lot of the resources right from San Giovanni Rotondo, and we try to make sure that we're giving you authentic information. There's unfortunately a lot of junk information out there about Padre Pio, urban legends, and things like that. So hope you'll check out some of our other broadcasts as well, where we have Padre Pio questions and answers and myths debunked, a special on the stigmata. We have all kinds of different things on our YouTube channel now that you can find. Of course, all kinds of information on the website, padrepio.org. And if you come and visit us, you'll find all kinds of things, all kinds of good stuff at the National Center for Padre Pio. So I hope you can do that at some point. Today, we wanted to talk about a lesser known thing about Padre Pio, which is a little sad because it's actually what he referred to as his great work. So Padre Pio, the man of miracles, right? The monk who has the stigmata, spiritual gifts like bilocation, reading of hearts, gift of languages, all kinds of things. But he considered his great work this home for the relief of suffering, which we're going to talk about, which is often and most easily referred to as a hospital. But Padre Pio didn't want it to be a hospital. He wanted it to be so much more than that, which we'll talk about. In fact, when they asked him, when he had this vision and it first started to come into planning, and Padre, what would you like to call it? Instantly, he said, home for relief of suffering. So let me jump in a little bit here. So Padre Pio was a soldier in World War II as a young man, World War I, as a young man shortly after his ordination. He was frequently in and out of the hospital, and back and forth. They would send him home to get the native air. He would come out, and the Italian army didn't take it easy on him. Even though he was already a priest, they were recruiting brothers and priests to serve in the medical corps, which he did, but he was always sick. There's a neat picture you can find of Padre Pio in the uniform and everything. But anyway, in being back and forth to the hospital, he noticed two things. One was that the medical and physical quality of care just for the body was not especially good. And two, there was a severe lack of care for the soul, for the spiritual side of a person. This particularly bothered him. Upon his discharge from World War I in 1918, he went to live right at the friary at San Giovanni Rotondo, where he would receive the stigmata later in 1918 that would stay with him for 50 years until he died. It started, another story, but it started to go away shortly before his death. But for 50 years, and practically speaking, up until his death in 1968. So he was there. He wasn't there for too long. And before his heart really started breaking for the local people. Little town of San Giovanni Rotondo, a little bit of a remote mountain town. If you've ever been there, you can certainly attest to the little kind of trek you have to take even once you get into town just to get up to the monastery. But practically speaking, and we're going back to 1918, even by now it's a 40-minute car ride to the closest town, which is the town of Foggia, the closest bigger town, I guess you might say, or main kind of town. Not a big city, but still a lot more populated and more modernized than was San Giovanni Rotondo. So when the local people from San Giovanni Rotondo would have accidents or illnesses that they were in need of hospitalization, they would have to take this 14-mile trek over broken mountain, pathways and back roads by carts that were led by oxes or horse. And half the time when it was anything serious, they were dead before they could even get there. There was one event that had an especially strong impact on Padre Pio's desire to build a hospital. There was a young man from San Giovanni Rotondo who was left wounded when a landmine exploded. And even after he made it to Foggia, he ended up being left on a cot in a corridor, bleeding to death. There was no room available for him, and there was no doctor that was able to treat him. So in 1925, Padre Pio founded a small hospital called the Hospital of St. Francis in San Giovanni, or close to it there. He was able to do this through donations he received from devotees and spiritual children. Just to put it in perspective, so starting in 1918, he gets the stigmata. We're still, it's the end of World War I. It is the Spanish flu is raging. So if you watched our other special about the stigmata, there's a period of time there before kind of the news really broke and people were coming to see Padre Pio, to see this monk with the stigmata, because they had other concerns, going on practically with the war and things in their family and so many people dying of the Spanish flu. But people start coming, and he's taking on what he calls spiritual children. He's taking, he's serving as a spiritual director for people, as a confessor, and he's talking about his vision to have this hospital. People are giving him donations, and he's able to help found this local hospital. It was small, but it was serving a purpose. But unfortunately, there was an earthquake in 1938 that severely damaged the hospital to the point that it couldn't be repaired. So locals are, again, coming to the friary. There's no hospital for them. So often when they're having desperate cases, they're coming to the friary to seek words of hope, to seek Padre Pio's prayer. People are desperate. They're looking for healings. And this greatly saddens him and has a really deep impact on him. And he's noting that the majority of people who are coming are really destitute. So 2 years later, so this hospital's open for 13 years, from 1925 to 1938. This little hospital, St. Francis, gets destroyed by the earthquake. 2 years later, in January of 1940, Padre Pio has this meeting in his cell of lay people who he had kind of pulled together and handpicked to help him with this vision to build this. He wanted something that was much, much bigger, that was going to be state of the art, not only in terms of medicine, but it's going to be a hospital that had the likes had never been seen before in terms of caring equally for the soul of the person. So he pulls these lay people together, again, in this little town of San Giovanni Rotondo. He's pulling people who are not especially or particularly, in all cases, of great means. Some are local people. There's a doctor who's a really good friend of his from Tuscany. He does have a pretty successful business there with him, but certainly not anyone who's ever designed or opened a hospital before. But so that night in January of 1940, the official, you might call first plan, certainly the first official meeting, they have minutes from this meeting, takes place. And he said that it was at this time that his dream, this home for the relief of suffering, was born. He even made the first contribution to the hospital himself. Someone had given him earlier that day a small gold coin that was gold color. It wasn't actually made of gold. It was worth a few cents. And he said, I want to be the first to make an offering for the home for the relief of suffering. Unfortunately, World War II got in the way of any real work beginning. You have a lack of labor, a lack of materials, things being needed for the war. So nothing really happened from 1940 to 1947. However, in late 1946, they were able to incorporate the organization. Padre Pio lays the first stone in 1947. Now, it sounds a lot, you would think if he was laying a stone that things were a lot more organized than they were. Perhaps he had some money saved up, or he had, that there was a good financial foundation, or there was a lot of planning that had been done. But to the contrary, there were not any types of prints, blueprints or plans or real organization or anything like that. There were many critics of Padre Pio's plan to build a hospital in the mountains of Foggia, believing the project to be impossible just because of the sheer, the physical things that were going to be required to blow through, dynamite the mountain, to get materials up the mountain, etc. They thought that the idea of constructing a hospital, certainly the magnitude of what Padre Pio wanted, to be unattainable. He really wanted, like I said, this world-class, large hospital with cutting-edge technology and the best doctors, and just that half, the other half being the spiritual half, but just that part alone just seemed completely impossible to people. The locals had been overjoyed when they had the tiny little hospital of St. Francis there. They couldn't even believe that happened. So to imagine that this was going to happen, this was unthinkable to them. But Padre Pio would not be discouraged in this regard. The physical construction of the building wasn't the only great obstacle. Funding was another one, especially since Padre Pio refused to borrow money from any banks to fund the building of the hospital, insisting that he was going to rely on divine providence coming through the gifts of benefactors. He did receive one sizable gift from a French businessman towards the beginning of the construction, but as you can imagine, that ran out very quickly during the first phase of construction. While individuals continued to send smaller gifts, a great deal of a major source of funding was desperately needed to keep moving on the hospital, especially given the type of institution and the way that Padre Pio envisioned it. It would really seem at the time that his team was in big trouble. However, a woman named Barbara Ward, she was a magazine author and for the Economics magazine. And she was traveling through Italy in 1948. She was reporting on post-war construction efforts, and in particular, looking at those projects being funded in Europe by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the UNRRA. Now, her fiance, happened to be the director of field operations. She traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo and was very moved by the efforts of Padre Pio and all those who were helping with this project. She was also very struck spiritually by Padre Pio, of course, as all people were. And she says, particularly one evening when she attended his mass. And if you've heard any of our other talks, that's so many times the case, is people are so changed when they see Padre Pio praying the mass. So Ward calls her fiance, who's the field director, to have this discussion. And then she also calls up former mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia, who was the director general of the organization following his no longer being a mayor. He was tapped to be in charge to become the director general. The hospital was ultimately approved a large grant of approximately $340,000 US dollars in money at that time was the equivalent. And so it provided enough for construction to continue moving forward. As a side note, the Italian government actually kept about 40% of the money which the United Nations specifically designated and gave to them to give to Padre Pio for that. And he was pretty angry about that, and understandably so. But they got enough money that they could continue moving forward with the construction of the home for relief of suffering. Following that, a great portion of funding came from private donations from citizens of the United States and also from Switzerland. They came from all over the world, but a majority of private funding coming from those two countries. And Padre Pio had such an admiration. He really, if you've heard us talk about his relationship with the GIs during World War II, so he was already kind of taken with the Americans. He would refer to them as the Americani, his beloved Americani. And in appreciation for the financial support given particularly by Americans, you look across the facade of the building, they still have flags of all the different countries who helped to build the institution. And in the middle, second only to the Italian flag, is a flag of the United States of America. But let's rewind a year or so to the beginning of construction before they got this gift, this large gift from the United Nations. Padre Pio had appointed a gentleman named Giuseppe Orlando to be the director of the project. And he would later recall that he eventually, he would have these dinners at the friary with Padre Pio. He would be invited. And he stopped sitting next to him because he said Padre Pio was constantly elbowing him and nagging him during meals to start the work. You have to get this work started. You have to start the work. And Orlando was heard to reply, start work for a big clinic without a drawing, without a design, without an engineer. You're really putting the cart before the horse. But work did start without a plan. After Padre Pio laid that cornerstone for the building, local farm laborers were hired to begin creating an access road for the construction, even before they had a plan for the building. Giuseppe Orlando, as a director, he chose as his principal builder and architect a local man named Angelo Lupi, who was not only a self-taught engineer. So among all the different people they could have chosen from, they chose a local man who really taught himself different aspects of the trades. He was also highly eccentric and temperamental. They said he dressed very strange for the time and the place. And he was described as being, quote, either in the stars or in the doldrums. He could be soft as a baby or wild as a beast. And they said he would often have fits of rage when he felt that he was being limited in his creativity for the project, or if he felt frustrated by red tape. So despite Lupi, who's Angelo Lupi, the principal builder and architect, besides being eccentric and his strong temperament, he ended up saving, it soon became obvious why this was the one chosen to do this. He ended up saving a great deal of money in the construction of hospital building due to his insistence on using low budget, low tech building techniques, which he had taught himself. He also employed the use of local farm laborers rather than people who were seasoned in construction. They said he kind of ran things like the military, the way that he lined them up and had them doing things. But one of the things that's beautiful about it was that he then gave all of these poor farmhands, he taught them his techniques. So they ended up then having these building skills themselves. But he mined stone from the mountains, created a special lime kiln, made it possible not only to build the exterior of the building and great portions of the interior, he also created bathtubs, sinks, bowls, and indoor and outdoor tiles and paneling using these techniques. He used the kiln to make plaster. He had no water on site, so he constructed a tie-in with a nearby aqueduct. He used leftover wood and iron from scaffolding to create beautiful pieces of furniture and hospital beds. He did a lot with wrought iron work. So he not only saved Padre Pio and the planners a fortune, and they didn't have a lot of money, but he produced a hospital building which is as beautifully magnificent as it was functional. So there's everybody kind of looking around and saying, why in the world did Padre Pio and Orlando choose this person? But divine providence would seem to indicate why. There were a number of people in leadership, of course, who were critical to the building and the establishment of the hospital. And many of them who Padre Pio handpicked had no prior experience either in medicine or in construction and planning of this magnitude. One of those, one of the people who really was very instrumental was Dr. Goldie Elmo, or in English, William Sanguinetti. He was a physician from the Tuscany region of Italy who was a longtime friend of Padre Pio. He was really important in keeping Angelo Lupi calm during many of the tantrums that he had, to keep him happy, to keep construction going. He also became a real jack of all trades during the whole process of the hospital. So here's a man who's trained as a medical doctor, but he's doing everything from driving trucks, supervising workers. He's using dynamite to blow up parts of the mountains, and he's planting trees and all kinds of things. So he was also responsible for helping Padre Pio to found his prayer groups, which we'll talk about, which are the heart of the Home for the Relief of the Suffering. I'll talk about that at the end, but also to found and run the magazine. So as he started this Home for the Relief of the Suffering, they started this magazine named after it, that a lot of the subscriptions was keeping people informed. And I believe that subscriptions were also being used to help fund the hospital. So Dr. Sanguinetti is taking care of all these things. Unfortunately, he died suddenly of a heart attack at age 60 in 1954 before construction was finished. And he was a good friend of Padre Pio. Like we said, he was critical in this component as well. And Padre Pio, we see a very human side of him. He was angry. He was heard to express his anger at God. And you get an interesting glimpse into Padre Pio, because someone said, Padre Pio, that he is with our Lord now, and God has a plan. And Padre Pio said, well, of course I know that, but I wish that God would have told me his plan, because I would have asked him to keep him here longer, because as we know, Padre Pio was constantly dialoguing with our Lord. So anyway, he was very angry. But that's interesting to me, because I think that it kind of gives us hope, in a sense, that when we have feelings of true feelings of disappointment and bewilderment and frustration with God, that here's this great saint that felt that as well. So after his death, Padre Pio, the plans for the Home for Relief of Suffering continued to be rife with problems. Death of a second director, sudden death of a second director who died of cancer very quickly at age 55. And then the builder, the principal architect and builder, who we talked about, Angelo Lupi, who had the temper that had to be kept in check, he was fired by a replacement director. And he barricaded himself, Lupi barricaded himself into his office and said, you're not going to get me out of here until, the courts make me go. And so like a lawsuit incurs, and ultimately they prevail against Lupi. And yes, you will leave. You were fired. So he says fine, and takes all the construction plans with him and leaves. So it was a mess. But nevertheless, they were undeterred. And the building would finally be completed a year later in 1956. The inauguration took place on May 5th. And 5 days later, the first patient was admitted. So despite having, I believe it was 250 beds in that when they first opened the hospital then. And Padre Pio really has this beautiful cutting edge facility. In fact, when some people would criticize him and say, oh, you're spending too much money, you're a friar, and he would get very angry and he'd say, there's nothing that is too good for the sick. There's nothing that is too good for the sick, for the poor. They deserve to be treated medically as best as they can. They deserve a humane, a beautiful environment. So despite this, he was not happy to sit back and say, okay, we're done. On the first anniversary of the inauguration in 1957, he gave a speech in which he announced his plans for expansion. He wanted to have a medical and religious center, which would include the following: a nursing home, an intercontinental study center, so that medical professionals from around the world could come and advance themselves not only in medical training, but also in Christian studies. a center for the prayer groups that he founded, a cenacle for priests, and retreat houses where people could come and enjoy a retreat on the ground. So you can really see here where he is really sticking true to his desire that this is going to be equal parts top-notch medicine, equal parts top-notch spirituality training as well, and spiritual care. Later, he would even expand it more, his vision to include the building of Christian daycare centers and institutions for the training of children with special needs, which in Italy, it translates into spastic centers, but it was for children with special needs that would be put up throughout Italy. Padre Pio is known to have said, these works here that you're calling great works, these are not simply my works, they are God's. And this, just as God shows me, is what we are doing. So, as we said, Padre Pio didn't want these to be known as hospitals. Several times he was known to have referred to it as a clinic for souls, saying that the goal of the work is namely to care for the bodies so that we may arrive at the souls. Today, and it continued to grow, both in size and the number of departments after Padre Pio's death, but also in status. And today, the hospital is truly considered to be world-class, top-notch, cutting-edge. Not only do they care for people there physically and spiritually, it's also considered one of the leading research centers in Europe, and it's respected throughout the world, and international conferences have been held at the facility as well. Eventually, Padre Pio donated the hospital to the Holy See, who granted him administrative privileges for the rest of his life. So ultimately, they wanted him to he didn't do so much administering as kind of overseeing and making sure everything was in accordance with the mission that he had. That there were, and there still are, lay people who serve on the board of directors of the foundation, which runs the hospital. You can't talk about Home for the Relief of the Suffering, which in Italian they call it Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza. So the locals will refer to it as Casa Sollievo. And you really can't talk about, or just the Casa, and you really can't talk about the Casa without talking about the prayer groups. In and around World War II, Pope Pius XII, who was still Pope when Casa Sollievo opened, and was very, very happy with the work that Padre Pio did, and had all kinds of great things to say about it, both spiritually and in terms of the science and the medical technology that had gone into it. But Pope Pius XII also was asking for faithful around the world to form prayer groups to pray for the world. He saw this impingement ever coming in of secularism into the world, into the church, and influencing the church. And so he really wanted lay people from throughout the world to start these prayer groups. So Padre Pio, in response, who always supported the Holy Father, even when the Holy See sometimes did not necessarily support him during like the sanction that he had, which was cleared up, but he was always loyal to Holy Mother Church, always loyal to the Holy Father. And he said, Holy Father wants prayer groups. We're going to start these prayer groups. And then he decides that the prayer groups that are started, he wants prayer groups started particularly for the Home for the Relief of Suffering, that these were going to serve as the heart of because everything that was at the basis of this hospital was spiritual. So they were going to be the heart of the Home for the Relief of Suffering. So, and there are about 1,700 groups, Padre Pio prayer groups throughout the world today. We have one at the National Center for Padre Pio. They meet the third Saturday of the month. But what is so neat, what is so special, if you're a devotee of Padre Pio, about these prayer groups, is that he started them himself. They had their second international convention a few days before his death in San Giovanni Rotondo. So he was very aware of them. He put in the pillars, he put in the guidelines for them. The rules that he gave to them, the general rules, were common prayer, charity, obedience to the church, and perseverance. In more detail in particular, he wanted them to pray for the church, the Pope, for world peace, and especially for the patients and the work of the home for the relief of suffering. So when you go to San Giovanni Rotondo, you see the giant. If you look at the picture that I used for the thumbnail for this video, you'll see that's the facade of the front of the hospital as it is now. And kind of below that, a couple tiers down the mountain there, is the center, the office for the prayer groups. So when people want to start a prayer group, they actually write to do it through the website, but you end up writing and sending in paperwork to the office, which is there. And he wanted the office to be there. He wanted the head of these prayer groups throughout the world that support the great work to be right there with it. So the prayer groups are there for the benefit of the people in them, of course, for the benefit of the church, and also for the benefit of the great work. So I hope I've given you a nice introduction and overview to what Padre Pio called his great work, Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, or Home for the Relief of Suffering in English. All kinds of resources that you can learn more about this great work of his. You can find that at padrepio.org. You can call area code 610-845-3000 and ask for more resources. A number of the books that we have give great detail about this phase of Padre Pio's life and his work. And imagine, he did all this while he was spending the majority of his waking hours in the confessional, waking up at 3 a.m. to say his mass, which for a good part of the time was at 5 a.m, climbing into the confessional, spending most of the day there, coming out to eat just a tiny little bit because they made him, and not really finishing his prayers till 11 o'clock at night. So it kind of blows your mind. So anyway, lots more to learn about Padre Pio here on our YouTube channel and through our website, padrepio.org. My name is Nick Gibboni. I am blessed, privileged to work for the center. I hope that you will come and visit us sometime. May God bless you and your family. St. Pio of Pietrelcina, pray for us. Remember always, in the words of Padre Pio, pray, hope, and don't worry. God bless you.